Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Greetings and welcome back, Hydrogen Rising listeners. Thanks to all of you for joining us again. Sandra Safro and I are excited to be back and have a really interesting conversation that's going to be a little more focused on commercial issues today. My co-host, as always, Sandra Safro, the Associate General Counsel at the Edison Electric Institute. Welcome, Sandy.
Hey, David. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Maybe before we get into our guests today, there's been, I think, some exciting developments at DOE lately. And of course, we're all still waiting on the issuance of the funding opportunity announcement for the $8 billion regional clean hydrogen hubs. I know there's a ton of activity around that. And I know, too, I think there was an interesting program yesterday that the DOE Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office hosted on hydrogen fuel cell projects in disadvantaged communities. And that really struck me as an important focus for the agency.
Yeah, I think so too, David. I mean, we're seeing environmental justice issues really front and center for the Department of Energy and really front and center for this administration more generally, but also in a number of different aspects of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I don't know if I had shared this on our podcast before, but EEI had hosted an event for our members on the IIJA implementation where we had some of the folks from the Department of Energy come and speak and share some thoughts. And one of my main takeaways from them was that we should expect a significant amount of activity from DOE in late summer, early fall. So I expect we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, the top part of the wave. I'm not sure.
Tip of the spear. I think that's right. We'll see if DOE issues any of these on October 8th, National Hydrogen Day. Well, fingers crossed they issue it before that, Sandy, but, maybe we'll get it on the 8th, and that'll be a clever little activity by the department. So, well, that's interesting. And of course, to our listeners, stay tuned as developments break with DOE. We'll obviously focus on that. But today, we are very excited to welcome into the Hydrogen Rising recording studio my partner from K&L Gates, Tariq Fedda, who is based in our Washington, D.C. and London offices. Tariq's practice is focused on commercial issues for clients in the hydrogen sector as well as other commodities. And there are a number of issues that are playing out right now that I think are really challenging for entrance into the hydrogen market. So we're excited to talk to Tariq. Tariq, welcome to Hydrogen Rising.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just since my intro on you and your practice was a little bit cursory, maybe just give us a couple minutes on your practice and where you really focus with your clients.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a partner at the Energy Infrastructure Resources practice here at K&L Gates. I work primarily on energy transactions, and a lot of that is commodity offtake agreements, whether that be hydrogen or LNG or power. And, that also isn't just the offtake agreements that we work on, but also the development of the projects themselves. So the projects that will be either producing or generating the commodity for sale, we work on that development of those projects. A lot of times the offtake contract is a very central part of the development of the project, which kind of is the core revenue contract that will support the economics of the project. And so those tend to have a lot of focus around them, and then they're negotiated up front before the facility that we're producing the commodity is even built. So we're spending a lot of time on that.
So that's interesting, Tariq. One of the things I know you've been working, as you said, on hydrogen matters. I do expect that given what is going on in Europe right now, and I know your practice has a heavy focus on Europe and the Middle East, I do expect that with the current situation with Ukraine, that you are, some of your work is probably reverting back to a lot of your kind of longtime practice in the gas sector. Is that accurate?
Yeah, certainly it is. I mean, when the war started, there was an idea that renewables were going to get an increased focus. And that was kind of true in the beginning. There was a lot of talk about the importance of shifting to renewables, and including in that is hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas. But what has transpired in the months since is that all the attention has been focused on actually replacing Russian gas as quickly as possible. And the quickest way is actually to import LNG from other parts of the world into Europe. And so that's where a lot of the focus has been. And there's some kind of detailed consequences of that, which we can talk about, a little bit later. But in general, that's true. That my practice especially has, while it has been transitioning into hydrogen, and that was the trend, it seems like there's been a little bit of a pullback and focus on getting through the current crisis, which is really a crisis right now. I mean, in Europe, it is quite a crisis that regulators and business leaders are trying to grapple with.
Yeah, and we certainly, I think we see that here in the U.S. too. There's still a lot of focus on hydrogen, but there's no question that natural gas is still a critical part of the equation. Sandy, I expect, even with your membership and its interest at EEI and looking at new opportunities, new technologies, new ways of producing power, but gas is still king in a lot of places, it seems.
Yeah, David, I don't know if folks will have seen this, but I think it might have been last year or the year before, Princeton University put out, I think it's called the Net Zero Study, something along those lines, and really looking at what our fuel mix of the future is gonna be. And natural gas is a part of that fuel mix for quite a long time, in large part because we need reliability, we need resiliency in the grid. And so I think to some extent, as much as our members at EEI and I think the electric sector more broadly are very focused on clean energy goals, and they have aggressive clean energy goals through the next decade, 2 decades, there's the recognition that we are not really quite there yet. And we need to make sure that we take an intentional approach to the future, and that we continue to move towards the future, but that we maintain, again, the reliability in the grid.
It's a similar thing in Europe, actually, because on the upshot, some interesting things we're working on in Europe, some of the gas infrastructure that's being rolled out to import LNG is explicitly required to be able to be transitioned to import different renewable gases in the future. So particularly in Germany, for example, they are installing quite a lot of infrastructure to import LNG, but it is a condition that this infrastructure is able to be transitioned in the future to importing hydrogen and other green gases.
But I'm not sure that technically we even know how to do that yet, right? I mean, it's to Sandy's point about an intentional conversion over time. I think part of the concern, it seems to me, in Europe is that in a way, it can't be intentional right now because of the war, right? It's reactive to try to find a solution as winter approaches. It's a little, I guess, maybe with the return of Game of Thrones on HBO, it's good to say winter is coming, right? But it's really true, and that drives policy because you have to make sure that people are able to heat their homes, right, in winter.
David, just for listeners who might be wondering what study I was just kind of fumbling to think of the name of, it's Princeton University's Net Zero Americas study.
Got it. That's great. Thanks.
So just to pivot us back a little bit more to the hydrogen conversation specifically, you mentioned, Tariq, that the offtake agreements are negotiated before construction of the facilities. And I think we've talked in prior episodes, and our listeners are probably familiar with the sort of nascent and developing nature of the hydrogen economy at the moment. So I would be interested in your thoughts on what some of the obstacles are at the moment to negotiating and concluding these hydrogen offtake agreements that you're working on, given kind of where we are in the development of a hydrogen economy.
Sure. So, I mean, in many cases, the development of hydrogen facilities has taken the mold of LNG facilities. which is, as I was saying, they would seek to negotiate a long-term contract in advance of taking the final investment decision to build the project. And that would support the economics and the bankability of the project. And many developers and financiers are looking at hydrogen in a similar way, that because there's such a high capital cost to build and a long time to recoup the cost, that the facility that's selling the hydrogen would need to have a long-term contract with a creditworthy buyer at either a fixed or escalating price, but a determinable price that can support the cost of building the project. And part of the issue with green hydrogen as opposed to blue hydrogen, I know some people don't like to use the color terminology, but in Europe, it's been very clearly supporting the green hydrogen camp, meaning electrolytic hydrogen that is
from renewable energy.
From renewable energy, exactly. Yeah, without carbon capture, sequestration, or anything like that. So part of the issue with the long-term contract for that type of product is that the price is actually higher than hydrogen that you could get on the market today. And the hydrogen users that are on the market today, that the buyers already using and buying hydrogen at a given price. And so this new product, which is completely green, let's say renewable hydrogen as the terminology being used in Europe, it would be at a higher price. And so there are some buyers who are willing to buy at the higher price, but the bigger obstacle to entering into that long-term contract is the definition of what is renewable hydrogen. And that's the question that I think many different areas are approaching differently. But in Europe specifically, there is an idea of what that means. And when I say there's an idea, there's the Renewable Energy Directive, which has been through several amendments, which promotes the use of renewable energy in the European Union. And there is a specific obligation on the member states of the EU in the Renewable Energy Directive to ensure that at least 32%, and it's been proposed to amend that to 45% of all energy consumption in each member state is from renewable sources. Part of meeting that obligation is using renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which includes hydrogen. But the Renewable Energy Directive didn't actually specify how to determine whether a fuel counts as a renewable fuel of non-biological origin. And that was left to the European Commission. And those rules on defining renewable hydrogen had been outstanding for a long period of time. Actually, they were meant to be proposed by the end of 2021, but they weren't. And then they were finally proposed in May of 2022, by an instrument called the Delegated Act, which the European Commission can propose to supplement the Renewable Energy Directive. And the proposed rules set out what it would mean for hydrogen to be renewable. And within those rules, there were very strict guidelines on additionality, meaning that the renewable power that was powering the hydrogen had to be additional on the grid. Because the idea was that if hydrogen production was taking away from other renewable power on the grid, then that would create other unintended consequences, potentially increasing the price of electricity, which is already at record highs, and taking away from other uses of electricity. So, but the issue for entering into contracts, to go back to your question, is that these rules aren't final. And these rules were proposed in May, and they were open for public feedback until June. And then the next step after that is for final rules to be proposed, which then can be either approved or rejected by the European Parliament. And until that's done, it's not clear to any of the players in the market what the rules are within Europe for hydrogen to be treated as renewable. And so we've been working with clients who have contract negotiations underway, but they can't even commit whether they can meet those rules or not. So, for example, if I'm working for a seller and the buyer says, well, I'll buy your product, whether it's ammonia or hydrogen or another hydrogen carrier, but it must meet the European rules, the seller doesn't know whether they can commit to that or not because the rules aren't clear.
Sure.
And they've been long promised, but they continue to be delayed because the rules that they propose are considered by some in the industry to be too stringent. And so the feedback ends up being quite strong to relax the rules. And then the European Commission takes it away and continues to try to refine the rules in a way that will help actually kickstart the buying and selling of renewable hydrogen, which is what they want, which is the incentive here.
Tariq, I have one follow-up question for you. One of the commercial issues that we hear talked about quite a bit in the United States that's related to this is, I don't know if tracking is the right word, but the ability to identify how the hydrogen that you received as a buyer or the hydrogen that you're selling as a seller, how that was produced. It's particularly an issue, I think, here in the US because we may be producing hydrogen. In fact, very likely we'll be producing hydrogen from a variety of different production pathways. We might have hydrogen produced from natural gas. We might have it produced electrolytically. We might have it produced electrolytically using renewable energy. Is that an issue that you're seeing, that traceability? Is that an issue that you're seeing with your clients and in Europe? And if so, are you seeing the emergence of potential solutions? I know, for example, here in the US, that there are a couple of different initiatives underway to try to create some kind of a marketplace with traceability elements in it.
Yeah, I mean, certification is definitely going to be an issue once the rules are clear. So, but I think in Europe, they also have a more of a centralized way to deal with that, which is the guarantees of origin scheme. That is currently in use for renewable power. So, by analogy for renewable power in the United States, you've got IREX or different kind of environmental attributes that are used to trace whether the power is renewable. But these are, in many cases, private entities or regional entities. In Europe, there is a Europe-wide mechanism called the Guarantees of Origin Scheme, and it is implemented by each member state independently, but it is currently in use for renewable power, and it's expected that it will also be extended to renewable hydrogen. I think the bigger issue is first understanding and finalizing what the actual rules for certification will be. And I think that once that is done, the certification will follow. And since they do have a framework for that in the region, it will probably be easier to implement once that's finalized. I think in other areas, it might be less harmonized and less easy to proceed with the certification. But, if we think that the first major buyers of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, will be in Europe, at least that's, kind of our feeling, is that the real impetus to buy renewable hydrogen is coming from this region more than others. So even if you're producers in the Middle East or in Australia or in South America, for example, they'll still have to meet the European rules in order to certify their product as renewable for purposes of consumption here.
That's really interesting perspective. I think, we tend to have more U.S. focused guests on the podcast. So I really think this comparison is helpful for our listeners who are truly global. I guess maybe I wanted to ask a bit. I mean, I understand that challenge in the commercial negotiations. I guess I would just ask you, as a practitioner in the space, are deals still moving forward, though? I mean, do you feel like the hydrogen business is still advancing in Europe? I know that, you said there's a lot of focus on LNG right now and trying to kind of solve the immediate crisis, but does the governmental slowdown in the publishing of the rules, do you feel like that's had a tangible impact on deals actually getting done?
Yeah, I think it has, but okay. I think there's enough interest from buyers and sellers to continue working together because everyone realizes that these are long-term projects and that they will take time to develop and to get to FID and to build. And so people are willing to continue discussing, negotiating, getting to a place where what might just be left is some of the certification points. So there are some deals that are continuing to progress. I don't think there have been any long-term offtake contracts for hydrogen from European sellers and European buyers that have been concluded. I think there's attempts at that. So, for example, there's a German government scheme called H2 Global, which is a scheme that is the government is supporting, which will aim to have a private government-owned company called Hintco to purchase long-term from any supplier from around the globe, and then to sell short-term within Europe. So the idea is that the difference between, or the delta between the high price that you would pay for renewable hydrogen today on a long-term basis, the difference between that high price and the shorter price that you can get selling
spot
or shorter term to the users, then the government will cover that for a transitionary period to help the hydrogen economy get kickstarted.
I mean, I think that's really interesting because that has been one of the discussion points in LNG, as you're aware, as we've worked with on some of our clients. Is there a governmental mechanism that would allow for essentially the government to be one of the customers of the LNG, right? Whether it's a member state government, presumably. And so what's the status of H2 Global and HintCo? Is it up and running, or is it just theory at this point?
Well, it's more than theory. So that's why I say that there is progress happening, but it comes back to the certification. So one of the requirements to participate in the HintCo program is that your product has to meet the RED II Renewable Energy Directive requirements, which are not finalized yet. So if you're a seller, you can continue. So HintCo has come out just recently, I think last month, with details of its program. And this is public information. It's on their website and a proposed term sheet and things like that. But it's sellers will have a hard time signing up to anything until they're sure they can meet the requirements, and the requirements won't be known until they're finalized. So that's it comes back to that issue, which is that, and I think the European Commission knows this. They've at least admitted to it, right? That they know that this has been a obstacle, and they're trying to move ahead. But it seems like after these delegated acts were proposed in the summer, and the feedback was received, the feedback period closed, we were expecting more movement a bit more quickly on the finalized rules. Those haven't come out yet. It seems that they're probably all focused on LNG at the moment, because there's also a joint buying program that is being discussed in Europe. So, and also an electricity market intervention, which has just been proposed. So the European Commission is quite busy with kind of dealing with the immediate crisis at hand. And it seems like, unfortunately, hydrogen is taking a bit of a back seat until some of these more pressing issues can be dealt with.
Sandy, that is what Tariq just described is fascinating if you think about it from the U.S. I mean, one of the things that the Biden administration has done is issue an executive order mandating the kind of conversion, if you will, of the federal government to clean energy. I mean, you think about the U.S. federal government, the deployment of, not just military, but civilian, the buildings, everything, and the amount of energy that the government consumes. Kind of query, Sandy, whether it's a concept we could ever get our arms around in the U.S., that the government kind of take a role as buyer, right? And then, of course, for its own need, but also enter the market and see if maybe there's a way for them to provide short-term hydrogen to help continue to boost the development of the industry here. It's a centralized concept, Tariq, and as you know, like the U.S. generally shies away from centralized concepts like that. But
well, it's interesting, David, because there is actually a provision in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that requires DOE to set up what is effectively a revolving loan or a revolving fund for, I think it's for electric transmission development projects. The idea, David, is to help spur some electric transmission projects by really helping to provide a more certain level of support in terms of capacity. But the Department of Energy would not remain a customer of the transmission project forever. Eventually it would roll off, and that's part of the discussion that DOE is trying to spark with its request for information on this, part of IIJA. But it's a mechanism that has at least, has been explored in the transmission context, and maybe there is room for that exploration in hydrogen.
Yeah, interesting. Tariq, just one kind of, well, I don't know, I was going to say a factual question. It may not quite be factual, but I do think it would be interesting for our listeners, without revealing client confidences, obviously, but You talked about long-term agreements. I'd be curious just for a little color around that for our listeners. If you're talking about a green ammonia project or methanol or something, like what are you looking at these days? Like what are clients talking about in terms of long-term? Is it 10 years? Are we talking 20, the way the LNG industry was built? Like what does it look like right now?
Well, it's an interesting question because it also depends a bit on your buyer, right? If you have a project that is looking to produce green ammonia for use for bunkers, for ship fuel, well, your buyers are not used to buying anything beyond a shorter term because this is what they're used to.
That's the industry standard.
Exactly. And that's how they operate. Now, you've got forward-thinking companies like Maersk who are publicly announced that they're buying methanol fueled ships, not hydrogen derivatives specifically, but methanol fueled ships. And they will enter into long-term methanol fuel supply agreements because that's what they need to fuel those ships. But on the other hand, if you've got a buyer, for example, in Japan, who is looking to use ammonia to fire their power plants, and they are investing in upgrading their turbines that they can run on ammonia, then they'll be looking at buying long term. It'll be part of the investment decision to upgrade the machinery will be to have this long term source of fuel. So it depends a little bit on the buyer class and type that you're looking at and what they're used to. For example, the H2 Global scheme is a 10-year program. They're looking to buy 10-year, for 10-year terms. And we've seen 15 and 20-year terms proposed as well for different projects.
Okay, interesting. I think that has been true in the LNG business too over the years, right? I mean, I remember there were always discussions about whether European utilities would end up being LNG export customers of the U.S. because of concerns about long-term contracts. They've obviously crossed that bridge, right? There's a number of European utilities that are long-term off-takers. We also, similarly, I remember in the import days in the United States 20 years ago, there was discussion about whether U.S. gas utilities, local distribution companies, would sign up as a long-term import customer. And they could never cross that bridge because of they're regulated by a utility commission. And the notion of signing a 20-year import contract for gas is you can't do that and still guarantee that you're going to protect ratepayers, that you're going to protect the average consumer who relies on you for gas deliveries. At least that was the thinking. So it's not surprising to me to hear that there's variation in the market. Well, look, we've taken up enough of your time. I know you're busy and there's a lot going on. It's been a really interesting conversation. Maybe Sandy, if another few months' time when the market evolves and once we get the rules, Tariq, maybe we could have you back. Maybe we could have one of our colleagues from Brussels join you and we can have a spirited discussion about what the rules look like. So thanks, Tariq, for coming on Hydrogen Rising.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in again to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. If you have any questions about today's episode, please feel free to reach out to me or Sandy, or of course our guest, Tariq Fedda, a partner at K&L Gates. You can find Tariq's profile online at klgates.com. And until the next episode, stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.